This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. Fellas, you've heard the phrase, look good, feel good, right? But why not add smell good to that too? That's where Sterling Soap Company comes in. First, Sterling Soap is 100% natural and has a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne. Second, there's a scent just for you. How about burgundy? Yeah, it's more than a color. The Sterling Soap folks blend natural essential oils with hints of mahogany, golden amber, and sandalwood. Or how about D503, an intensely masculine scent inspired by Legend by Mont Blanc. And third, you will feel good about the price. For just a little more than you'd pay at the grocery store, Sterling Soap will leave you feeling clean, refreshed, and ready for whatever's next. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com.
Face off with Firefly Publishing for another drop into the fascinating world of pro hockey history with Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories 2. Following his bestseller, hockey historian and writer Eric Zwig opens the doors to the Pro Hockey Hall of Fame, revealing a treasure of untold tales, bizarre incidents, and captivating trivia that will leave the most devoted puckhead astounded. Just to name drop a few of the players he's included in this book are Wayne Gretzky, Jaromir Jagr, and Bobby Hull. Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories 2 is a must-read for pro hockey fans who crave more than just scores and statistics. Mr. Zwig invites you to uncover the true stories that have shaped the sport, ensuring that you will never look at the game of hockey the same way again. So skate on over to Amazon.com, Target, and Walmart to get your copy now.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello once again, sports fans, and welcome to the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. And coming to you from the Sports History Network, this is the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I'm Dana Augusta, along with my co-host Charles Combs, and we will go deep in the woods to discuss and possibly debate sports history topics that you didn't know you needed to know. So pull up a chair, sit back and relax, and pump up the volume for a dose of sports history info and maybe even a few laughs. So with all that being said, here is the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, a member of the Sports History Network. There are losses that can endure for a day or a week or maybe even a year. But there are losses that some fans deal with that last for years, decades, and some that you just never get over. On this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, Charles Combs and I will reveal the losses that we have endured as fans that we have never gotten over and have finally come to terms with. These losses that were historically relevant big games, or some even championship games, but all of them rank as some of the most memorable moments in the history of sports in this country. We even have a boxing match from the early 1990s that makes the list, and no, it is not Buster Douglas beating Mike Tyson. Later in the show, we're going to send a shout out to an NFL regular season game from December of 2003, a game that featured a miraculous finish by a team looking to return to the playoffs. However, the team that pulled off this gridiron miracle failed to complete the deal. And to this day, some 22 years later, I still somewhat feel responsible for that team's loss, simply because I opened my mouth and said something that I shouldn't have. All that and more on this all-new edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast here on the Sports History Network. And we're back, and you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, the place where we give you the best of sports from back in the day. I'm Dana Augusta, along with Charles Combs, and tonight we're doing something that I think is while doing some research on this, and even though there wasn't much research to do, I kind of want to look at this episode as something of a sports history therapy session, where the two of us are going to be bouncing off of each other about as far as traumatic losses that we have endured as fans. And every fan has this one game or several games or whatever where you're just like, it is the worst loss conceivable. Okay. And I'm going to give you a quick example of what we're talking about using my father. Chuck, my father is a big Raider fan. And he says, of all of the losses that the Raiders has suffered in his lifetime as a fan, which goes back to the mid 1960s, the one loss that he has never gotten over and he will refuse to get over is the Immaculate Reception game. My father actually sat me down and he went through it like Kevin Costner did in the movie JFK, like the Zapruder film of the JFK killing. He didn't catch it. See, it bounced off the ground. See, he didn't catch it. See, the ball hit. It did hit Frenchie Fuqua. It didn't hit Jack Tatum. So he just kept going on and on about that. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, Chuck. This was your idea. You were the one who came up with this idea, and I think it's a crackerjack idea, guy.
Oh man, it's great to be back again, and I agree with old Mr. Augusta, man. That ball didn't hit the ground, man. That ball, Franco Harris didn't catch that ball. He got hands of stone, man. But but yeah, we're just looking forward to it because you and I, we kind of long suffered together, and some of these I'm going to talk about. You literally probably go back through our friendship. You probably had to talk me off the bridge a few times regarding some of these, man, because that's how traumatic they are, man. So looking forward to it tonight.
All right, man. And let's get started. We're going to start with one. First off, before we do that, I would like to let everybody know that you can catch us on Instagram. You can catch us on Twitter. You can catch us on various different social platforms. Also, and I want to do this also before we get started. If you want to contact the show, you can hit us up at historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. And if there's any traumatic losses that any of our many, many listeners want to share with us, please do. We read them on air. We talk and laugh about it, when that happened, so we're going to read some of your emails that you may send of traumatic losses that you may have suffered. The email address, once again, please email us. Don't be afraid. Drop us a line. Do that sort of thing. You can hit us up at historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. So hit us up on that. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Now we're going to start off. Okay, I think I'll start it off, with a game that really, to this day, it hurts me. A lot of people realize that I am a Charger fan, lifelong Charger fan. And a lot of people may assume that the worst loss in Charger history was the Super Bowl. No, that's not it. We kind of expected to lose. I was just hoping for hope's sake that we pull off the upset against the 49ers, knowing full well that's not true. But there is one game that to this day I have never gotten over. The date, January 14th, 2007. The AFC Divisional Playoff game, Patriots versus Chargers in San Diego. MVP, LaDainian Tomlinson, 14-2. Marty Schottenheimer was the coach against a subpar Patriots team, at least for their standards. And we ended up losing. We ended up losing this game, and for the life of me, to this day, I still don't know how we lost.
I totally get it, man. You just that's actually on my list too. And you sometimes have these losses where you try to recollect and then try to piece together, kind of like similar to when there was a fire in the fire department and all that. They try to sift through the debris to see the cause of the fire. When you try to sift through the game, you can come with no plausible explanation, and you just wind up mad all over again. And that doubled as mine too, because they were the superior team, favored to win the Super Bowl, and you were up, if I remember, 21-13 with 6:25 to go, 4th and 5. Tom Brady gets intercepted.
That's the
So
play.
that
That
apparently
is the
seals
play
the
that.
game.
Oh my God!
Instead of
That is the play. That's the play that hurts. You know. Go ahead. Finish explaining the play.
and Troy Brown strips the ball, and the Patriots recover for a brand new set of downs, and they go ahead to punch it in, and then that just kind of took the wind out of your sails. And if I remember correctly, wasn't Schottenheimer fired right after that, or maybe he lasted one more year? I
No, he
can't
was
remember.
fired right after that, but it wasn't because of that. That was a whole soap opera that took place in San Diego in that offseason because AJ Smith had just became general manager, replacing the deceased John Butler, who had just passed away like maybe 6 months earlier. And there was some differences of opinion on how the Chargers should be put together offensively, or pretty much the whole team actually. But there was a lot of differences of opinion. Marty Schottenheimer wanted it one way. A.J. Smith wanted it the other way. Dean Spanos sided with A.J. Smith, and Marty was let go. You know, and plus he was asking for a contract extension, which they didn't want to give him because he was asking for too much money because the Chargers don't like paying anybody. That has since changed, I think. But back then, the Spanos family had been known throughout the NFL as very cheap is an overstatement. They just don't like paying players. They eventually do bend to their will, but the Spanos family is very, 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 very tight with the purse strings, should we say. But that Marlon McCree play, Chuck, I'll never forget this. Tom Brady throws the interception. And I'm like jumping up and down like, yeah, we got him. And then all of a sudden, there's a fumble on the play. Troy Brown, strips the ball and I'm like, why don't you just fall down? Why don't you just fall? You know what I mean? So, dude, it was so heartbreaking. And then we still had a chance to tie the game. We were down 3. We still had a chance to tie it. And then Nate Kading missed the field goal. And we ended up losing the best regular season in Charger history, and we ended up losing 24-21. I think that was his 24-21. And it still hurts to this day that we were that close. Best season, MVP, the whole thing going in our direction. And I think as a franchise, we've never really recovered.
I agree with that. And it's just the hardest ones are the ones when you know that you had what it takes to win the whole thing. Those when you manage to squander those are the ones that are hard to get over, especially if you don't wind up getting one. And on my list, I have a few of those that are examples of those. But sticking with this topic, you guys wasted an MVP season, and I think at the time, and I'm not sure if this record still stands, that LaDainian Tomlinson, never mind, that's blasphemous to call him LT. But anyway, he had the record for most touchdowns in the season. I don't know if that record still stands or not, but he was at the apex of his powers, and you guys managed to blow that game.
We managed to blow that game, and also I think that year we had the record for most Pro Bowlers on that team. I think we had something like 10 Pro Bowlers from that team. Everybody from LT to Lorenzo Neal to future Hall of Famer that he's getting into the Hall of Fame this year, our tight end. Sean Merriman. And speaking of Sean Merriman, there was some controversy at the end of the game where the Patriot players was doing the lights out dance on the 50-yard line on the lightning bolt. And LT and Phillip Rivers was about to throw hands. And one of those players was Marvin Harrison. Was former Charger, not Marvin Harrison. Rodney Harrison. One of the players that was
Rodney? Okay.
Rodney Harrison was one of the Patriots at that time, and he was doing the lights out dance, mocking the Chargers, and they wanted to fight at the end of the game. And I was so mad, I was going to join them. I would have went out there to join them because I was that upset. How could you do this? And if you notice with the Chargers, we've blown more games than the law allowed in the last 20 years. If you look back on everybody say, well, we blow a lot of games. No, there has been a term called chargering where we've blown games, and that's not by accident. Okay, we just have blown a lot of games in the past.
Oh boy.
So that's
now I understand being mad. Oh, I'm sorry. I understand being mad, but you had 60 minutes to fight, man, and you didn't fight good enough. So don't get mad and fight now, man. Keep walking while you're talking, man. You lost, man. So,
but you talk about now. Let's talk about juxtaposition with just that statement right there. You and I have been in some confrontations, and you're the one who's the hothead. Okay, I was the one, and then now you're the one who's telling me that I need to step from the ledge. Okay, you talk about time heals all wounds. You know what I mean?
I'm hypocritical, man. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I'm hypocritical, man. So I'm hypocritical. I'm not ashamed to admit it, man. So yeah, man. But since you brought that up, it just seems like for whatever reason, Marty Schottenheimer, despite how great of a coach he was snake bit. So
he was. He definitely was.
Two of mine on my list, happened in back-to-back years. Let's turn the clock back 20 years.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, your turn. Go ahead.
Browns Broncos.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Which one?
Browns Broncos, man.
Which one?
In Cleveland.
Oh God.
Both of them. I got both of them. The
Which
first
one?
year, 1986, in Cleveland. In Cleveland, they got control of the game. Dog pound going crazy. The wind blowing off Lake Erie. It's cold as all get out. John Elway proceeds to go 99 yards in what is known as the drive to tie the game. And, everybody wanted the Broncos, kind of the Luca. They knew they wouldn't be, because that was right at the beginning of the NFC's dominance in the Super Bowl, starting with Super Bowl 19.
Yes.
The NFC won like every year until
John
97
Elway.
when the
John
Broncos
Elway.
ironically finally beat the defending champion Packers to win the AFC's first Super Bowl since Super Bowl 18 when Marcus Allen and the Raiders beat the Redskins. But anyway, they went 99 yards to tie the game, and then they blew it. And then old Rich Carlos with the barefoot out there, he come out there and kicked the winning field goal and beats them and sends them home. Then the next year, the rematch is in Denver this time. And, it's in Denver this time. And they're going and they fall behind. And then Ernest Biner just takes over the game.
That's right.
And he got the trash all the way to the can and then dropped everything on the front lawn and all that with the fumble. And and all of that, which cost them the game. And it's kind of tragic because they wouldn't have even been in a position to win that game had he not taken over that game, but he just couldn't finish the job.
Look, let's start with the 86. I remember both of these games as if they were yesterday. Okay. First of all, I'm going to talk about this quarterback a little later. But I've always thought that one of the most underrated great quarterbacks in the history of the National Football League was Bernie Kosar. And Bernie was, first of all, he had like this very, very funky delivery. Just real funky delivery when he threw the football. He had that cockeyed stance in the underneath center, and he threw sidearm and whatnot. If you remember right before that drive, what happened? Okay, it was like everything that could have happened, that could have gone wrong for Denver, went wrong. Kozar throws the long touchdown pass to Brian Brennan to give them the lead because it was a low-scoring, rock fight in, at Cleveland Municipal Stadium. Throws a long touchdown pass to Brian Brennan to give them the lead. Then they kick off. They muff the kickoff where the ball goes all the way back to the 2-yard line. Okay, and I think what happened was, if I'm not mistaken, they ran it out, but there was a clip on the kick returns. We put the ball back at the 2. And they had to go against one of the best defenses in the NFL outside of the New York Giants. And can you just imagine? I mean, like, I'm sitting here like, the Browns are finally going to go to the Super Bowl. That's what. And then John Elway just goes absolutely berserk.
Yes.
And I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, and that was when I started like, okay, this dude is really good, John Elway. I remember him playing at Stanford. I'd followed him when he was at Stanford and everything, but I had never seen that from him before. And I'm like, bro, this dude's different, okay? And he drove them down the field to score. Now, by the next year, I was over Denver. I'm like, okay, fine. Everybody was just cheesing over Denver like crazy in the late 80s. And Cleveland's back in it, but this time in Mile High. Now, when this game here was so different, because if you remember, Chuck, Denver had got off to this big lead in the first half. I was so like, dude, this is over. So I went outside and shot basketball. Okay, doing the AFC Championship game, because that was the late game that afternoon, if I'm not mistaken, because the Redskins had beaten the Vikings earlier that afternoon. That was the game when Darren Nelson dropped the game-winning touchdown pass in the corner at RFK Stadium, to send the Redskins to the Super Bowl. So Denver gets this big lead. I go outside, right? And my sister comes outside and she says, you may want to come back and watch this game because Cleveland's been caught up. I'm like, really? So I came back in the house in time to watch the last drive. And then when Ernest Byner fumbled it at the 2-yard line, I just fell off the sofa. I'm like, I just could not believe it that actually happened.
And he was going in for the touchdown because, to your point, it was a big deficit. And then he just took over the game, making play after play after play.
Yeah, exactly.
Underrated. He was always one of my favorite backs because, excellent vision, excellent footwork, juking, and that was in contrast to his battering ram mate Kevin Mack.
Kevin Mack,
straight ahead and just a bulldozer, and they really got that going. And that Cleveland team was good, man, because remember. They had on defense. They had Michael Dean Perry,
Al Bubba Baker, goalie, one of the Golick brothers. Who else was on that defense? Hanford Dixon was a corner.
Clay Matthews, baby.
Clay Matthews, exactly.
Frank
Minifield, right. On offense, Webster Slaughter. The great Ozzie Newsome. Even though he was kind of like Ozzie up Newsome. In years, but he was still Ozzie Newsome, So that team was loaded, but that team was just, as with Schottenheimer, snake bit. Cleveland still looking for their first ever trip to the Super Bowl.
Just snake bit, and then you just have to give Elway credit, man, because you go to back-to-back Super Bowls in like 3 and 5 years with Simon Winder as your running back, man. You got to really be able to deal.
Yeah.
And, if you got him as your running back, because I remember they, defense.
Who was the other runner? I remember there was Sammy Winder.
Carl Mecklenburg.
Yeah.
Rulon Johnson.
Who was the other running
Gerald
back?
Wilhite.
Gerald Wilhite. That's who I'm thinking of. Gerald Wilhite. Yeah. Because I remember Samuel Winder, and I remember, and
they brought in Steve Sewell.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you this. I asked this to somebody
So
the other
that was
day.
good.
I asked somebody on a previous episode, and his answer shocked me. I asked him the three amigos, the receiving corps for the Broncos. Now, he has been following. He had wrote a book about the Denver Broncos, especially doing that era of Broncos history. He had wrote this had an author on. I can't remember his name right off. I apologize, but I asked him this question: that Denver Broncos receiving corps, Mark Jackson, Vance Johnson, Ricky Nattiel, are they underrated? And he says, no, they're overrated. And I'm like, really? And he says, yes, they were average receivers at best. John Elway made them. And I'm like, and you know what? I couldn't argue with that because he's exactly right. Ricky Nattiel and Vance Johnson and Mark Jackson were not really, they didn't put up a lot of big numbers, but they just happened to be on the Broncos at the time where they went to 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, or 3 Super Bowls in 5 years, whatever it was. So I thought that answer was kind of surprising.
I would have to agree with that assessment, man. They weren't that good. I would say that overall they were adequate, and Vance Johnson could be above average at times, but none of them individually were guys that you had to necessarily game plan for. If you were like, they didn't keep you up at night if you were opposing defensive coordinators, because John Elway, he made the whole thing happen. And then in addition to that, we already talked about Sammy Winder. What about this name at tight end?
Clarence K. Yep. Clarence K.
Boom. Boom.
I mean, you got to call it the way it was. He wasn't that great. It's like, everybody talks about, could you make the argument that John Elway did so much more with less than any other quarterback in NFL history? Can you make that argument?
Probably so. Because I would say, yeah, probably so.
Because he didn't win until he got Rod. He didn't
Lamar
win.
Jackson.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't win a Super Bowl until he got Terrell Davis and Rod Smith. He didn't win a Super Bowl until he got them.
Yes. And you got to remember, they had the Hall of Famer Shannon
Sharp.
Club Shay Sharp. And then they also had at the other receiver, he's the equivalent of my Brad Davis in football. You got to have
Easy
this
Ed
guy on
McCaffrey.
every team. Easy Ed McCaffrey. Whatever you need him to do, big plays, moving the chains, blocking, because like a lot of that, they had kind of transitioned to a running team, and like a lot of those big runs, obviously Rod Smith and McCaffrey were very good receivers, but what's underrated about them, a lot of those big runs TD would have was attributed to their just dog mentality, blocking and holding blocks, and that enabled TD to break a lot of those big runs in that era.
All right. Well, let's move on to basketball, NBA basketball. And we talked about a game in our last episode, the 1987 finals, when Magic hit the hook shot over Mikhail in Paris. That one was traumatic for me, but not as bad as this one. And it's one of the most historic games in NBA history. In fact, whenever you think of the decade of the 1990s, at least when I do, I think of Jordan hitting the shot over Brian Russell, which he pushed off, and we both agreed that he did push off. When John Starks dunked over half of the city of Chicago in the night, it was a 93 NBA playoffs, I think it was. And
yes, it was.
But the third one is very traumatic for me, which is Dikembe Mutombo laying on his back with the ball hoisted in the air after upsetting the Sonics in Game 5 of the 1994 first round of the Western Conference playoffs. May 7th, 1994. Nuggets win 98-94 in overtime. Chuck, I was sick after that game because it wasn't necessarily, looking back on it, it wasn't necessarily the Nuggets played so well. It's just that the Sonics played so lackadaisical. For a team that won 63 games that year, they played as if they do, we got this. And every time the Sonics would do something, the Nuggets would counteract that and stay in the game and just kept with them. As the game got later and later and later, you could see the Sonics start to fall apart. Like, okay, this isn't supposed to be happening. Okay. And this team became psychologically damaged so much that the team ended up moving to Oklahoma City. That's how psychologically damaged this franchise was after this series. And it's a series that I never – this is the first time I watched that game when I was preparing for this. That's the first time I watched it since it happened. I actually went back and watched this game a couple days ago. And that's exactly what happened. They just fell apart.
Well, once again, it's one of those things that's even compounded by the fact that that particular season, that was the first year that Jordan had retired or was suspended, depending on how you look at it.
Depending on how you look at it, you're right.
I won't say anything about that. I won't, you know. But anyway, it was it was their championship to lose because they were far and away the best teams. The only teams that could stand in their way were the Rockets and the Knicks, and every time they used to play them, just due to that trapping and up and down style, they used to obliterate both of those teams. Yeah. And they just had everything on that team. They had Peyton, they had Kemp, obviously. They had if you needed bigs that could rebound, they had like Michael Cage and Sam Perkins. You needed scoring off the bench. They had Ricky Pierce and Eddie Johnson. And the Shrimp. They had at the two guard, they had Hersey Hawkins and Kendall Gill. Then if you needed defense off the bench, they had Nate McMillan and Vincent Askew. It's like they had everything.
They had ballers. They had the
1 through 12 deep.
Yes. Exactly. 1 through 12 deep, 63-19 on the season. And there were questions like midway through the year, like could they win 70 games? And they basically took their foot off the gas. And I think George Karl is essentially the Marty Schottenheimer of the NBA. Everywhere he goes, he wins, but he just never won a title. You know, do you agree with that assessment?
I won't go that far.
Okay.
No, I don't.
You wouldn't go that far?
No. George, Marty is a great coach that had some unfortunate circumstances, some unfortunate haywire things happen to him. George Karl, on the other hand, he is a guy. He's a guy that he's more suitable for a guy. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say that George Karl, it just seemed like with Marty, the things that happened to him was stuff that he couldn't control. George Karl, on the other hand, some of the decisions that he made were dubious at best.
Correct. And he was always a coach that was better suited. Like if your franchise is in disarray and then you need a guy to come in and establish a winning culture and a winning program, he was excellent at that. But then once it's time to take that next step from respectability to championship level, he was grossly lacking there. Because remember, the same team, the next year they lost to the Lakers in the first round again.
The exact same team.
Then when they finally made the finals in '96, the '94 juggernaut. No, they had been broken up. They had lost some of those pieces by '96 because those '94 Sonics. They would have really gave them the '96 Bulls a hell of a run, perhaps even beat them. But it's just like, and then just on the George Carl, remember in the '09 Western Conference Finals when he was in Denver versus the Lakers, Kobe and the Lakers. He
Yeah.
blew two games because one game he decided to have Anthony Carter inbound the ball. Then
Yeah.
another game he decided to have Kenyon Martin inbound the ball, and that was two games right there. He was known to blow at least one game per series.
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah, you're right, man. But yeah, that one. I mean, just like thinking about it, on one hand, it was really cool to see an AC beating one. I wish it would have been somebody else. Because I was a big Gary Payton fan and a big Sean Kemp fan. During that time, and watching the Nuggets. I mean, it just seemed like the Nuggets. Dan Issel. You can say what you want about him. Dan Issel's a great, great coach, and for that year, he proved how great of a basketball student he was, in that series because he put together a game plan essentially to neutralize the Sonics run game because the Nuggets with LaFonso Ellis and Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf could run the floor just like the Sonics could. But I think they just had more of a defensive presence, especially with Mutombo down low, because there was nobody, that could deal with Mutombo, going because Mutombo was just a man defensively, And in that game 5, essentially could be argued the greatest game of his career.
I agree. And then there was also a key underrated tactic that he employed in that series as well, because you mentioned Chris Jackson, aka Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, LaFonso Ellis, but then he played Robert Pack. Remember we
A
mentioned him in the
lot, yeah.
previous episode at the
Yeah.
end of the Blazers bench. He was with the Nuggets, and his athleticism, ability to finish around the rim. And sometimes even though you have matchups where even though Gary Payton is obviously a better player than him, but sometimes he just could not keep Robert Pack in front of him to
No.
save his life, and he was breaking down that trap defense, finishing over the top or presenting opportunities for other, and that flipped the entire series on his head, combined with the other things that you mentioned, like the rim protection and rebounding that Mutombo was presenting on the other end.
Right. So that's my game. That's my haunting memory of that game is, and that was the last game, incidentally, of the Seattle Sonics. Where was it? The Seattle Center Coliseum. That was the last game of that before they renovated it. Because remember, for 2 years they played in Tacoma while they were redoing the arena. And when they came back in '96, it was the '95 season, '96. I think it was the '96 season. They moved back in. It became Key Arena. Now it's what is it? The Climate Control Arena or something like that. The home of the Seattle Kraken now. But yeah, that was the last game at that time being known as the Seattle Center Coliseum. The last ever game there. But. Chuck, okay, your turn, Chuck. What's the one NBA game that still haunts you? I think I know which one this is, but I think I know. You didn't tell me beforehand, but I think I know which one this is.
You know exactly which one it is, man. I've only whined about it for 32 years, man. 1993 Knicks Bulls Eastern Conference Finals. Game 5. Now, let me just step back a game. Game 4.
Okay.
The Knicks you mentioned the Starks dunk. The Knicks had taken a 2-0 lead over over the Bulls, punctuated by the Starks dunk over Jordan, Horace Grant, all of them at the end of the game.
Pippen,
We went up 2-0.
all of them, yeah, all of them went contested a shot.
Yeah.
It wasn't like just a guy that was just standing under the rim. No, they tried to block it, and Starks kissed the rim on them.
Yes. Lost game 3 in convincing fashion, which was expected. So I was like, okay, fine. Game 4, I still remember the date, May 31st, 1993. Why do I remember it? because it was the day of my high school graduation. I still remember my mom, I'm standing at the top of the chair watching game 4 as Jordan scored 54 points. See, that all you kept hearing was Marv Albert, yes, yes. My mom, because I was so short and small, my mom had to put a hymn in my graduation robe. So I'm jumping around mad and I'm throwing her sewing off in a hymn. And then they win game 4.
I can see that. I can really see that. Yeah.
And nip and tuck all the way, and I be doggone the darn ball goes to Charles Smith underneath the basket. He was not rejected, not once, not twice, not 3 times, nor 4, but 5 times. And he could not finish it. And honestly, they fouled him a couple of those times.
Oh yeah, absolutely they fouled him.
I wouldn't have. You 6'11", you a scrub. I wouldn't have called it either. Slam the ball in the basket, and then that turned the series. And we had the 1 seed, had home court advantage, lost that game. Bulls promptly closed us out in 6, and up in smoke went our best chance to dethrone the Bulls, because I think had we gotten by the Bulls that year, we would have won the championship. Had we gotten by them that year, and that. Every time Charles Smith comes to mind, I just,
you just shake your head. You just shake your head. I remember that game, and my sentiments was exactly that. Of course, I wasn't a fan of either team, but I was rooting for the Knicks because I by that time I was starting to get sick of the Bulls and sick of Jordan, and he gets the ball. Now he is fouled. But in that situation, during the NBA playoffs, if you're down low and you're that big underneath the basket, they will never call that, because that's a bailout call, especially that late stage of the game, because there was less than a minute left when all of that took place. And he could not get the ball in the basket. Yes. And the guys that are, the guys that's contesting him are all smarter than he is. You had Horace Grant under there, who's 6'8"? You had Scottie Pippen. Yeah, he's 6'10" and athletic, but dude, you're bigger than him. Jordan, he's 6'6". You can't just rise up and just punch it. You just can't slam the ball through and just be going about your business. No, you just want to keep. And then he's from a Big East school. What school he went to? Did he go to Georgetown or? I know he's or St. John.
He went to Pitt.
Yeah, exactly. He's a Big East school, so he knows what's up. He knows that, you got to, that's Big East basketball. You got to go up with some force and go up with some man strength and slam it through. No, he want to lay it up all pretty and stuff like he playing at Pepperdine. Punch that through, man, and be done with it. You know what I mean?
and he kept bringing the ball down.
Bringing the ball down.
Well, at least now, I don't know what they teach. I don't know what they teach now, because it just seems like everybody wants to dribble. But back in our day, the big man, you always keep the ball you always keep the ball high, because you're bringing it down. To your point, he was surrounded by smaller defenders. He was basically negating his size, and he kept getting stripped of either block or stripped on the way up every single time. And he was getting hacked, but you a scrub. I'm not calling it either. You know what I mean? So, He cost them, and that just was that still gets my goat to this day. Still.
Man, I tell you, I'm a guard, and I know better than that. We're guards. If you're putting together a team, we will always be in the backcourt. No one will ever confuse us as being, on anybody's front court. No, unless we were playing with middle school kids. Anyway. You don't ever bring it down. That's fundamental basketball. That's just fundamentals, dude. Charles Smith gets the ball down low off of a rebound, offensive rebound. Now, I got a bunch of offensive rebounds in the stat sheet, which don't really mean anything, but you brought the ball down to their level, then you got to go right back up, and you getting hacked on the way. But I think what he was doing, he was trying to get a call. you know. But you will never get a call in that situation in the playoffs during the 90s. Come on, you're not going to get that call. Even though, I mean, yeah, you are a scrub. You are a nobody. But still, you're not going to get that call, bro. You're not.
Especially against Mike,
Oh, you're
'cause
right.
especially at
Especially
that
against
time,
Michael Jordan.
he was the golden goose. He was the gold. And then, the only thing that used to annoy me about, especially the NBC coverage at that time, they would be like, he earned that call, referring to Mike. Either it's a travel or it's not. Either it's a foul or it's not. What the
Yeah.
hell do you mean he earned it? I mean, you just call the game,
Yeah.
please. You know?
Yep, but unfortunately, that's still going on to this day. Still, right now we're recording this as the Game 7 of the NBA Finals is going on. And that's one of the pet peeves that we both have of the NBA right now. Moving on to baseball. Now, this one has a little bit of a personal story behind it, and for those of you, I know. Everybody growing up had a rival in your household, whether it is your brother or an older brother or younger brother. In my case, it was my cousin Adrian. And he was, at the time, a diehard New York Mets fan. Darryl Strawberry, Keith Hernandez, Dwight Gooden, Gary Carter, those were his guys. He was a big, big New York Mets fan. Me, I really didn't have a team, but I wanted to go against him whenever it suited me. In this case, it was 1986. Game 6, 1986 World Series, Mets versus Red Sox. I rooted for the Red Sox because, A, it was going against him, and secondly, I didn't know this until I'm 13 years old, and this is when I really started getting into sports history when I was like 13. I had not realized that the Red Sox had not won the World Series since 1918, which was 3 years after my grandfather was born. So this was kind of like historic, right? And then I remember in the playoffs, when the Red Sox beat the Angels on that Dave Henderson home run off of Denny Moore in Game 6 to force a Game 7, I was like, this is unbelievable. And they kept saying that have a chance to win their first World Series since 1918 and stuff like that. It's been all this time since they won the World Series. And I'm like, dude, this is going to be historic. Then they play the New York Mets. And we've talked about this before. The Mets survived that 6-game marathon, the Game 6 marathon in the Astrodome against the Astros because they wanted no parts of Mike Scott in Game 7. So that was like their Game 7. So they get to the World Series, get to Game 6. Okay, now everybody knows what happens. Okay, but from my perspective, this is what happens when Dave Henderson hits the home run in the top of the 10th. I'm like, they finally did it. And my cousin, we're sitting in the living room with him, myself, and my grandfather. And we're watching the game, and he's just sitting on the side. When Dave Henderson hits the home run, you can see him on the verge of tears. He's 4 months older than I am. He and I are essentially the same age. And he was like really ticked off, and I am enjoying this, totally enjoying it. Then it happens. Okay, Red Sox scored to take the lead in the top of the 10th. Red Sox scored again with a Wade Boggs with scoring Wade Boggs. Marty Bear scored him on a single to make the score 5-3. They up 2 in the bottom of the 10th. I'm going into the bottom of the 10th. Okay. Then what happens after that? The Mets get 2 outs back to back. So it's 2 outs. And we got 1 out away from winning the World Series. And then the collapse happens. Okay. Gary Carter singles. Then Kevin Mitchell pinch hitting for Rick Aguilera. He singles. And then you get 2 strikes on Ray Knight. You got 1 strike away from the World Series. And then Knight singles to center field, scoring Carter. And then Kevin Mitchell reaches to third base. Then comes Mookie Wilson. At this point, he is like, my cousin Adrian is like, just totally like holding on to hope, And then the wild pitch. The wild pitch from Bob Stanley goes to the backstop. Kevin Mitchell scores to tie the game. And you go back and you look at interviews by Mookie Wilson, and he says that when that happened, all the pressure was off. Because the game is tied, what's the worst that can happen? A ground out, fly out, whatever. We're going into the top of the 11th. The game still goes on. He hits a slow roller to Bill Buckner, and the ball goes through his legs, and Vin Scully loses his mind. The ball gets through Buckner. Here comes Knight, and the Mets win it. And I'm like, I just fell on the floor. My cousin just goes, yeah, just jumping up and down. My grandpa was like, I can't believe this stuff right here. They had it. So anytime somebody shows that Bill Buckner error on first base when the ball goes right through his legs, I'm like, why do you have to show that? It brings back the starkest memories of my childhood.
Man, Ed, you have to remember, to your points, it was 2 outs. You know how they do these probabilities on ESPN now, winning percentage. It was 2 outs. Nobody was on base. And you remember their closer at the time was Calvin Schiraldi at the time. And then he unraveled and brought in. And then, every team has that player or two that the fans know he's a bum. The fans know he's not going to get it done. It seems like everyone seems to know that except for the head coach or the manager. And in this case, it was Bob Stanley. As soon as they bring Bob Stanley in, all of the fans knew that it was a wrap at that point. And then, to your point, in quick succession, the wild pitch, then the missed ground out, and then the kicker to this, remember, that forced the game 7, and then the game 7 was on a Monday night, remember?
Yep.
Simultaneously, they had Mets Red Sox game 7 from Shea, and Monday Night Football had Giants Redskins, if I remember.
Yes, that's right.
Rutherford.
That's right.
Simultaneously that Monday night, and it was just back then that was in the one TV days in every household. We were just flipping back and forth. Most of the people watching most of the baseball, obviously, but then every chance you got, you flipped over to the football.
Yeah, I remember a friend of mine. And one of the guys here on the network had mentioned this, and I had to Google it to see if it was true, but it was true. For a split second on the Shea Stadium scoreboard, they put up a graphic that says, "Congratulations, 1986 World Champion Boston Red Sox." It was up there for a minute, and then they cut it. They cut it off. It was up there for a second.
They did.
But there were a couple
I remember that because the NBC cut to the sign.
Yep. And there are two big controversies that came out of this. One, did Roger Clemens, who was the starting pitcher of this game, did he want to come out of the game, or did he ask out of the game? That was the big, because Clemens swears that he had a blister forming on his finger, on his throwing hand. And I forgot which finger it was. I want to say it was the middle finger. And he didn't want out. The blister was forming, but he didn't want out of the game. McNamara, the Red Sox manager, basically said that he was begging to come out of the game. So people don't know who to believe. Did Clemens want out of the game, or did Clemens want to stay in the game? And because he was dealing in this game before they went to the bullpen and eventually Calvin Schiraldi and then Bob Stanley. Another controversy. Why was Buckner still in the game? Every game during the series, when it got late in the game, Buckner was replaced by Dave Stapleton on first base. And then what really exacerbated the situation was the fact that at a previous at bat, Buckner was hit on the hip by a pitch. So why was he in the game at that point? Why was he still in the game knowing that A, he was hit by a pitch, and secondly, all the games in the series up to that point, they took him out late in the game. Because he was like, 35, 36 years old at the time. So that's some of the controversies that still remain unanswered after Game 6 of the World Series in 1986, which still to this day still breaks my heart.
I learned something new today regarding the Clemens situation, and regarding Clemens, based on history, and I'm not placing blame on anyone, but based on his history, I would be more inclined to believe McNamara based on his history, because he does have a tendency to lie about things, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And when I heard about that, I felt the same way.
Secondly, I think this was a classic case of the old James Evans counting the kitchen. He have a good interview at the job. He say, "Well, baby, go buy the great champagne and all that at the party. The job is in there." And then when they had the party, he come home, got to tell Florida he ain't got the job. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
This was a classic case of that. I think McNamara think he had it in the bag.
Yeah.
And Bill Buckner was a grizzled veteran, because you remember he was also dealing with an ankle injury at the time too.
True.
And,
that's right.
And I think he just wanted him to be on the field for the last out.
Yeah, because he had never won a World Series ring up to that point.
Never getting.
Yeah, he had never won a World Series ring after that. Up to that point, he had played for the Dodgers in '74 when he lost to the A's in the World Series. Because he was the first baseman for the Dodgers in '74, and
yes,
and he wanted to be. I guess McNamara wanted him to be on the field to get for the championship and everything. And everybody knows the story about the locker room. At the NBC had set up cameras and everything in the locker room to celebrate the Red Sox finally winning the World Series. And when all of the hits and everything started happening and the Mets rallied and stuff, every trace of them, NBC, Bob Costas and crew being there was all taken away before the Red Sox came into the clubhouse at the end of the game. And I got that story from, in my opinion, the greatest sports documentary of all time, Baseball by Ken Burns.
Okay. Yeah, so, I remember hearing about that as well, and that was just bad. That was bad.
Okay, so we're on baseball. So what is your baseball your baseball moment that still caused you pain?
Okay, well, as you know, I'm a Cub fan, so I'm gonna list a few and focus on one. And this is only to emphasize that I'm a glutton for punishment. That's all.
Well, you won a World Series fairly recently, so
1980. So, but Cubs Padres, Padres, 1984, 2-0 lead. Game 4. Steve Garvey hits a game-winning home off Lee Smith. Next day with his fine Cy Young winning. Rick Sutcliffe cruising along. We up 3-0. Ball goes through Leon Durham's legs and all hell breaks loose. You remember that 89 LCS against the Giants when Will Clark beat us single-handedly, basically by himself.
Right.
And then you remember 2008, Lou Piniella was the manager. Cubs won a major league leading 97 games, only to be swept in the divisional round, which is the first round, by the Dodgers. First 2 of which was at Wrigley. But you obviously know where I'm finna land now.
Yeah, absolutely.
2003, Cubs Marlins in LCS. We were up 3-1 in the series and 3-1 on the scoreboard in Game 6.
Yeah, Game 6.
Mark Pryor on the mound with 5 outs away. we got one out. Someone hits, I think Juan Pierre hits a flying ball into the stands, and Moises Alou, the left fielder, attempts to catch it in the left field bleachers, but someone by the name of Steve Bartman gets involved in the play, and then after that, all hell breaks loose. And I don't think that lost the Cubs the game. I think he got all of the bad press because that was the moment when all Cubs fans realized, uh-oh, we about to find a way to lose.
Yep.
So then you remember in that we it was a it was an inning in that doesn't play ball right to shortstop Alex Gonzalez, and we would have went into the ninth with the lead.
Yep.
He booted it, and then it just fell apart, and then we lost that game, and we still had Kerry Wood for Game 7, but everybody who's a baseball fan knew there was no chance in hell that we were going to win that game. And just a quick backstory: my late father, we were up 3-1, and my father, we lost Game 5 in Florida. My dad was like, "Well, y'all gonna still win it." I'm like, "Man, I'm telling you right now, the Cubs are going to find a way to lose." And I'd be damned. And I still remember calling you the day after Game 6.
Yes.
You were trying to basically convince me we had a chance, and I think you were lying. You were just trying to make me feel good.
I was.
We're done. We're done. I'm like, we're done. And I think we got, I don't even remember. I remember cutting the TV off because they were showing, you could see all of the old people. I mean, they was gray and wrinkly. Some of them was 89, 92 years old. And you could see them all crying because they knew that
was their best chance.
They were not going to live to see the Cubs. They were not going to live to see the Cubs win a World Series or even go to the World Series in their lifetime. They knew that was it. And it was just, that's just the worst. That's just the worst sporting event. It's the most solemn sporting event that I've ever experienced.
Well, there was a couple of things about the whole Bartman incident that there's one thing about it that really bothered me when it happened was the fact that Fox Sports kept showing the guy. You know what I mean? Why you gonna keep showing him? Okay, it happened, okay? And all doing the collapse. Because you can't really call it a rally. You can't call it a rally. It was a collapse because the Cubs misplayed so many routine plays, and it was essentially they lost the game and eventually the series essentially by death of 1,000 paper cuts, because there was in that whole thing that happened in the 8th inning where they gave up like 8-9 runs, okay, and the ball wasn't really hit out of the infield like talking about. It was like, you talked about the booted double play that would have ended the inning, and they would have got out of there, at least still had the lead. I think that the whole thing of Fox showing Steve Bartman, the whole, like every time they got a hit or every couple minutes, they show him again. And then they show him again and again and again. And I'm like, bruh, stop. Okay, because by this time, we didn't have social media. They didn't have social media like it was back then, but they did have something like that. So they knew what the dude looked like. So he had to be escorted out of Wrigley, and it got like really ugly for that guy. And and after a while, I felt sorry for the dude. I really did. And I'm like, bro, I know this guy. And ESPN made a documentary about it. The name of it, Catching Hell, which was a very well done documentary about that whole incident. And then the Cubs finally winning it in 2016. And the Cubs was gracious enough to give him a championship ring when they finally won it in 2016. But that whole thing about they kept showing him over and over again. I was like, bro, stop. Bro, stop. You and I both, have degrees in journalism. We both were in journalism school together. Bruh, that's like, okay, it's like a guy commits some kind of a crime and you got it on film and you just kept showing him over and over and over and over again and you basically ruined his life. That's essentially what happened with this guy. And I just felt bad for him when all of that was over with. You know what I mean? And I'm like, bruh, I just dude, stop showing his face. Stop. And I know you have
for him too.
yeah, but I know you had at the time, some water has come under the bridge. I know you at the time, you were like string him up,
No, I never blamed him.
Okay.
I never blamed him because I think what really caused the Cubs to completely unravel was Alou's reaction to not getting the ground ball.
Right.
I mean, to not catching that fly, because he just acted like, oh my God, and then you could tell that just psychologically, the Cubs and the entire crowd just fell apart at that point, and they couldn't make routine plays. But now I know you're like saying that it was bad. I feel bad for him, I do, but to keep showing him over and over. That's Golden Glove. That's Golden Globe television. You keep showing him every time something bad happens. You keep showing him. They kept showing his face. Now, I can't laugh at it at the time, but I never blamed him. But it's funny because I'm just sitting there with tears in my eyes. And my dad said, it's going to be okay. They're going to win the ball. I'm like,
no, they won't.
Sitting there just flabbergasted. Like, I can't. He's sitting there in just total disbelief that the Cubs found a way. And the Cubs have the unique ability to find a way to lose a game that's never happened before. Baseball is 100-some years old, and they find a way to lose a game in a distinct way that's never occurred before. Only they have the ability to do that, and that was it.
That year, the Cubs hadn't been to the World Series since 1945. They hadn't won it since 1908. And
1908.
They were, to say they were due. I think what really what really got the Cubs was not the error, was not the play itself. It was Moises Alou's reaction to it, and it was somewhat of a deflating thing, okay. And then I think that everybody's psychological reaction was, as a Cub fan, like you were saying, it's like, oh God, here we go again. Okay. And you see that a lot in sports. I remember one case in particular. The fourth time the Bills had went to the Super Bowl, they were playing Dallas here in Atlanta. And if you remember in that Super Bowl, Buffalo was leading at halftime. And they were like, oh my God, can they actually find themselves finally winning a Super Bowl? They had the lead at halftime. Dallas gets the ball first. They drive down the field and scored. And you could see just the Buffalo Bills reaction was just instant deflation, like, oh, shoot, here we go again, And you saw that on the sidelines. And then Emmitt Smith goes crazy in the second half. But they basically, in that game, if you go back and look at Super Bowl 28, it was like, the Bills had a distinct chance of winning that thing. But just one bad thing happened, and it just kind of fell apart.
No, they didn't. All you heard, the Cowboys were basically like, okay, let's quit playing around. Let's lean on them with this big offensive line.
Yep.
And then all you heard in the second half was the great Pat Summerall, Emmitt running. Emmitt got room, gain of 51 yards. Emmitt running, a gain of 17. He just, because Emmitt and John love that running game. And then, John, the game over when John Madden brings out the sweat contest. You remember?
Yeah, exactly.
The sweat contest with the Cowboys offensive lineman whose pants the sweat would reach their knees first. He said, so when he started talking about that, the game is over, basically.
Yes. Okay, you had a very good one as far as like the baseball one that gave you pain, and it's one of those games that you go back and you watch it and you're like, how could this happen? Okay. Moving on to college football. Now, this one sticks with me because if you were placed in this situation, what would you do? I did a whole episode about this going on 2 years ago to signify the 40th anniversary of this game. It's one of the greatest college football games ever, and it came down to a very controversial coaching decision. January 2nd, 1984, the 1984 Orange Bowl. Number 1 Nebraska against number 5 Miami in the Orange Bowl for essentially for the national championship. Now let's set it up. Miami was number 5. They ended up winning the game 31-30. Miami was the number 5 team heading into this game. That afternoon, this is all that happened heading into the game. Texas, number 2, had lost to Georgia 10-9 in the Cotton Bowl. In the Rose Bowl, Illinois, led by quarterback Jack Trudeau, was blown out by UCLA 45-9 in the Rose Bowl, so they're out. At number 3, Auburn, with Bo Jackson, Lionel Little, Train James, they beat Michigan in an ugly 9-6 Sugar Bowl in New Orleans. So all of that took place, except for the Sugar Bowl, because Sugar Bowl was still going on Auburn looked so unimpressive against Michigan. And you got to remember, this is 1984. Back then, they voted on who was the national champs. So all of that took place early that afternoon or taking place during the game when Miami and Nebraska played, and it came down to a very controversial coaching decision by Tom Osborne. Now, I'm going to ask you, Chuck. I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway because the folks may not know. If the game is essentially you're up 1 or you're behind by 1 point, okay, as Nebraska was, late in the game, less than 30 seconds to play. If you tie, you win the national championship. If you tie, you still win the national championship because you're the number 1 team in the country. And all of those other teams behind you lost. Would you go for 2 or would you kick the field goal? If you go for 2, you'll win. Or, in this case, what happened to Nebraska, they didn't make it. But if you kick the field goal, you tie, but you still win the national title. What would you do?
I'm going for the dub. I'm going for 2.
Yes.
No ifs, ands, and buts about it. You know, you want to settle it on the field. I don't want no team or any team to have any claim that they could whoop me or that I didn't whoop them. We didn't whoop them. And then you also got to remember in that game, they were down 31-0 in that game.
Yeah, they were down big.
I think they were down like 31-0.
No, they were
down big, and they came all the way. Oh, go ahead.
Actually, Miami led 17-0 at the end of the first quarter. It was 17-0 at the end of the first quarter. They come back, okay, and they cut it to 17-14 at halftime. And then Nebraska ties it 17-17 in the third. But Miami goes up by 2 touchdowns, goes up 31-17, okay, in the third quarter. Okay, because 2 rushing touchdowns by Alonzo Highsmith and Albert Bentley. Remember those names? And then Nebraska scores 2 touchdowns, both of them by Jeff Smith to get to within 1. They had this one play that I will always remember, and I screamed when this happened. The play before Jeff Smith scored the touchdown late in the fourth quarter to get to within 1 of Miami. The play before that on 2nd and 8, okay, Turner Gill throws over the middle to a wide open Irving Fryer. I mean, this dude is wide open and he flat out drops it. I mean, the ball was literally in his hands. And everybody remembers how Irving Fryer in the NFL was a pretty decent receiver for the Patriots and Dolphins, okay? decent. His biggest thing in the NFL was that he was once the president of the NFL Players Association. But in this game here, he was like part of the original college football triplets of Nebraska. Turner Gill at quarterback. You had the Heisman Trophy winner Mike Rozier at running back, who I was a big fan of, and Irving Fryer. Rozier gets hurt in this game. I totally forgot that Mike Rozier gets hurt in this game. He turns his ankle. He hurts his ankle. I think he sprains his ankle in this game, and he was done for the game. Okay, so that's why Jeff Smith was in the game. But Nebraska, they on 4th and 8, they run an option to Jeff Smith, and Jeff Smith takes it all the way for a touchdown, and that was for 4th and 8. And so that set up the Tom Osborne going for 2. Now, I don't disagree. You have to go for it in that situation, Chuck. In my opinion, you have to go for it. The problem that I have, though, is the play call. You just scored on an option.
Yes.
You scored on an option. Okay? You have the best offensive line in all of college football. Dave Remington, Dean Steinkuhler, that group, just line up and blast away. You've been running the ball all year. Okay. Did they do that? No. What they ran was an RPO, a run pass option. Okay. Turner Gill, as great as he is and as great of a quarterback that he was, he looked like he was hesitant when he threw it. Because basically what it was a run pass option to the right, and he threw it to the tight end, and he overthrew him. And the Miami defender knocked it away. So I'm thinking, I would have gone for it, but the last thing I'm running is an RPO. Because what is the old adage in football? Every time you drop back to pass, 3 things happen, and 2 of them are bad.
Correct. And I totally agree with your sentiment there that, obviously going for 2 is the right call, but you have to go with your staples in certain situations. That's like if you go, like last episode we talked about that controversial ending in the 88 Game 6 NBA final. You go into Kareem, and he shoots a turnaround jump shot as opposed to the hook shot. It's the right person to give the ball, but the wrong move. And if I remember correctly, wasn't Roger Craig on that team too?
Yes, he was a backup running back. He was one of the backup running backs.
Him too. So and it's
exactly.
Like you just got it on 4th and 8, so they put the ball on the 3-yard line. You got one of the greatest wishbone quarterbacks of all time, Turner Gill, a Nebraska legend. You have to put the ball in his hand and get that option game going. And if they beat you, if you go down and they stop your main staple, that's just something you can live with. We went to our best, our bread and butter. We were just bested, and that's something that you can easily live with, easily. But to your point, to lose on something that isn't necessarily a staple nor a strength, that's just that has to replay in those guys' minds over and over again.
With that play call, you essentially let the Miami defense off the hook, okay? Because if you look back at that game, what got them to that point? Because they had to rally twice, okay? They had to rally twice to get to that point. And what did they use to get back to that? Their bread and butter, the running game, the wishbone, and that was Nebraska football, the wishbone, and they used that better than any team I have ever seen, and you can't go away from that. That's exactly what you just cannot go away from that. You can't go away from what got you there. and you go run, and maybe Tom Osborne was thinking, okay, maybe we're going to catch him off guard by running a RPO, maybe, but no, you let them off the hook with that. You got the best offensive line in college football, line up, man to man, hat on hat, and blast him in there. And if you get in there, you're national champs. If you don't, okay, they got us that time, But we went down, we're doing what we do best, But running a run pass option in that situation with that team, I kind of question that.
Correct. And you mentioned, I can't remember, was Miami undefeated in that game? Because
No, they lost one game.
Osborne he didn't want to leave it, but you don't want to leave that up to the voters
No.
and all of that, because, like back then they used to have, that was the old days of the
AP poll,
Associated Press poll, and then the UPI coaches poll, the UPI poll as well. And, and then you couldn't, later that decade, we had like 2 shared national championships in 3 years, like a few years later. So I guess he was like, let's just win it out right on the field. And I agree with the call completely.
Yeah.
But to your
I
point,
agree with the sentiment, but just the play call was
I disagree with the nuance of the.
Yeah.
Yes. I same here. Yes. Yes.
So that was mine. It's still considered one of the greatest games in the history of college football. By far, one of the greatest games of all time. Of all of the, and you look at the list of all of the NFL players that was in that game. Everybody, Bernie Kosar, Albert Bentley, Eddie Brown, there's so many that was on the field. Brian Blades was the defensive back for the Hurricanes. Then you had on Nebraska, you had Mike Rozier, who played for the Oilers. You had the aforementioned Irving Fryer. You had a few of the offensive linemen for the Huskers that went into the NFL. Dave Remington, I think, played for the Oilers for a while. You had so many that was on those teams. Like I said, Bernie Kosar, one of the first quarterbacks I ever saw that wore number 20, which looked weird as heck, but, but boy, could he sling it. And that was like one of the few teams.
He could sling it.
University of Miami was one of those few teams that ran a pro-style offense in the early 80s and was really good at it. You had them, you had BYU, who had the air raid offense, which teams are running now. Like high school teams are running the air raid offense, but in the 80s, it was like, this is new. This is like groundbreaking with Lavelle Edwards, But me, I love high-scoring games. I love offense. So anyway,
yes,
your college game that gave you the most angst.
Okay. Well, to put a bow on that last game, that was also the start of the Hurricane dynasty that went throughout the 80s and the 90s as well. That jumped that program off. But on to mine, ironically, involves the exact same school. 2002, Miami loses to Ohio State in the BCS title game.
Oh my gosh.
One of the most dominant teams of our lifetime. The previous year, the 01 Miami, like the 01 Miami team, they had like just at running back, they had Gore, McGahee, Portis, and tight end, they had Shockey and Winslow Jr. The safeties were Ed Reed and Sean Taylor. The receivers were like Santana Moss, Andre Johnson, and it was just insane. And the following year's team was not quite as talented, but they were very, very good too. And they the only thing that they had, I forget the Craig Krenzel and Maurice Claret, who I was never impressed with as a running
That might have been the last time.
That was the game most.
That might have been the last time I actually rooted for Ohio State in a game. I'm gonna be honest. I rooted for Ohio State in that game. That might have been the last time I ever rooted for them. Because Ohio State just does something to me. There's something about the Buckeyes that are just like, they just rub me the wrong way. They never did me nothing, but is just a team that it's just a program that just rubs me the wrong way. You know, they're so pretentious. Maybe it's because we're the Ohio State. Like there's another one. You know, come on. What's with this the stuff? You know what I'm saying? But
Yes.
go on.
Yes.
I just wanted to get that out there. That's the last time I rooted for an Ohio
But it's
State
like,
team.
you know, but Michigan always says, to their pretentiousness between Michigan and Ohio State, they say that Ohio State is the only time when a student transfers from Michigan to Ohio State and the GPA of both schools go up. But anyway, it's like but it's like that team. In my life, since the BCS era, I would say other than the Michigan team that won the championship the year before last, they are by far the weakest champion, by far, of the teams that won the title. And you remember that game?
Yeah.
That game was marred, remembered because Willis McGahee, he was on his way to the league and got his leg suffered a horrific.
That was a gruesome
And then
knee
also
injury.
you remember. Yes. Then you also remember in that game, they hadn't played their best ball. And even though Miami had stood in every position, unfortunately, they also had Ken Dorsey at quarterback, too.
That was the weak link. That was the weak link on that team. As good as Miami was, and as Ken Dorsey was a game manager in college, which is not really all that great. If you're a game manager in college, and you're known as such, then you got a lot of guys on offense, that making you look good. But really and truly, you're just a game manager for a high-powered offense with all of those future NFL stars on the team, and you basically look pedestrian. You know what I mean? How is that possible? Well, you got Kelly Winslow Jr. and Jeremy Shockey at tight end. Well, you got Frank Gore and Willis McGahee lined up behind you. You got Andre Johnson, Santana Moss on the outside, and you still look pedestrian? I mean, I could come out there, and throw for 300 yards with that group, but he wasn't even doing that.
Correct.
Barely. You know what I mean?
This was the crazy era. It's not as bad now, but this was the crazy era, like them as well as all of the SEC teams of the subsequent dominance in the years following that, where each year, due to the team's record, the starting quarterback would be in the Heisman voting type 5, and he's probably talent-wise about the 30th best player on his own team, but he's in the Heisman. He's in the Heisman race, for God's sakes, just because his team is good, not necessarily because of anything he does.
True.
But, speaking of that, it's just like he just kept the game close throughout. Then at the end of the game, remember, I think it was in the overtime, they had the game won. It was 4th down. Ohio State threw a pass into the end zone that fell incomplete. The Hurricane celebration erupted because apparently they've won back-to-back titles. The referee say, hold it. They pick up the flag and play resumes. Remember?
That's right. That's right.
Then Miami goes on to lose that game.
Right. That's
they
right.
go on to lose that game and all of that.
The phantom pass interference. That's right. I remember that. And like, what is going on here? And again, that might be the only time really in my life that I could ever remember rooting for Ohio State in anything. Craig Krenzel was the quarterback, right, for Ohio State. And you will never see in this day and age of college football where you have two quarterbacks playing for the national championship and neither one of them did anything in the NFL. I mean, anything. You look back, even during the days of the wishbone, the last time before that was maybe 1988 with Notre Dame against West Virginia, and you had Tony Rice and Major Harris. That's it. And they were basically wishbone quarterbacks. Even though Tony Rice that was big enough to be
But
a
they were both
prototypical.
playmakers.
Yeah, they were both playmakers, but that didn't translate into the NFL, though, unfortunately. During that time,
Correct.
it just didn't
Correct.
translate. NFL, they call it pro style offense for a reason. That's why you saw guys from BYU, from UCLA, from other big name schools that threw the ball become more successful. And we're talking about the early 2000s here, where you're starting to see college quarterbacks become more pro ready. And you still had Craig Krenzel and Ken Dorsey that basically couldn't pan out in the NFL. Now, Ken Dorsey went on to become a great offensive coordinator in the NFL, but that's all he was going to be. But good for him. He's an offensive coordinator, I think now for Buffalo.
Right.
I think that's where he is. But he's basically working with Josh Allen in Buffalo. But for the most part, I mean, his career never panned out. He was drafted by Carolina, I think it was. I think he was drafted by the Panthers, and it just didn't work out because he wasn't going to surpass Cam Newton. That wasn't going to happen. And Craig Krenzel, I don't know if he even went to the league. I don't think even Craig Krenzel went to the league. Just not thinking about it.
I don't think he did. He was garbage. Tim Tebow was a better passer than he was. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that.
No, you're not. You're not. It's some things we say are funny because we laugh at them because they're funny. In this case, we laugh at it because it's actually true. As ridiculous as that may sound, it's actually true. But man, I do remember that was the Fiesta Bowl, wasn't it? That was the Fiesta Bowl. Right, in 2003, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was.
I like
it.
Again,
2002 season, but early 2003.
January of 2003. Yeah, man, I remember that.
Yes.
This one, going to college basketball. This game here is the genesis of my hatred, my sheer, unadulterated hatred of Duke University.
I think you and I are going to have the same one. I be god dog.
My hatred of Duke. This happened my senior year of high school. March 1991, the national semifinal, UNLV versus Duke. And I think what really ticked me off about this game is nothing really UNLV did. But it was just the reaction of Duke winning that really ticked me off. Okay. And the nation's the way that the country and sports writers and everybody looked at UNLV and basically said, okay, they got what they deserved or whatever. Because you can say what you want. UNLV was one of the most dominant college basketball teams that we've had in the last 40 years. Yeah, they played a weak schedule. Yeah, they were in the Big West. But They won the national championship the year before, the last mid-major to win a national championship, and they beat Duke by 30 in the national championship game. They're the only team ever to score 100 points in a championship game. Okay, and they beat Duke by 30. And they started getting this bad reputation, which was so unfair because, one, they didn't like their style, and secondly, they didn't like their coach. They hated Jerry Tarkanian. The media hated him because he told the truth. And they became vilified. And you had Duke on one side, who these clean-cut kids from Durham, North Carolina, who play ball the right way. And you had Dick Vitale, the biggest Duke apologist of all time, which Dick Vitale I respect, but that's something about him that just gets with me, that just gets to me from time to time, is how much of a shield he is for Duke. And he's been like that for years. And after this game, the ESPN college basketball season essentially became a Duke basketball reality show. And talking about the game itself, they won the national championship.
Yes.
The Running Rebels were on a 45-game winning streak, looking to become the first team ever to win the national championship by going undefeated. And since Indiana in 1976, and you look at these, and you look at the players that they had: Larry Johnson, Stacey Augmon. I can name them by heart: Larry Johnson, Stacey Augmon, George Ackles, Anderson Hunt, Greg Anthony. Three of those guys went on to long NBA careers. And Duke had Grant Hill. You could say what you want about him. Bearing all the injuries, he could have been a Hall of Famer. I give him that. Christian Laettner had one of the most underrated. It was like, okay, I'm going to say this about Christian Laettner. Okay. He had a career that in some respects was underrated, but was better than what most people thought. Because he averaged something like 18 points a game for his career, and his career lasted like 14 years. Which is, if you think about it,
Yep.
it's something. It was somewhat overhyped.
Yes.
Coming out of school, but at the same time, he was better than what a lot of people thought. Okay, you had Bobby Hurley. Who knows what he would have done in the NBA had he not gotten into that car accident his rookie year? So we don't know what would have happened. And then you had Greg Kubek,
Yes.
who basically fell off the face of the earth after that game, and Thomas Hill. We never really saw anything from him either on the pro level. So the only thing I remember about Thomas Hill is him crying after they beat Kentucky a couple of years later. Was that the same Thomas Hill that did that?
Yes. That was the very next year. And speaking of Laettner, he was a epic college player, legendary college player, and he had he was above average in the pros. And it is, to your point, depending on your perspective. Some people say he's overrated due to where he was picked, because he was picked third behind Shaq and Alonzo Mourning.
Yep.
Then other people like you and I think he was slightly underrated because he made All-Star one year, and then he averaged like 17, 18 a game, right around 8 to 10 rebounds several years during his prime before, injuries and age caught up with him. And then I'll also say this about him, that he probably, I think in my opinion, certainly came around 30 years too soon.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
if he came around now, his game, the way the game is played now, his skill set he would dominate if he came around now, like the way his skill set is, where it's less emphasis on physicality, even though he was like 6'11", where he could play center, but really he was more of a power forward type of guy. He could post some, but he could face the basket too. He could put the ball on the floor, things like that. And back in the 90s, if you're anywhere near 7 feet tall, regardless of your skill set, they're going to throw you in that 5 hole and say, hold Shaq on the block on defense, which he could not do.
No.
And like if he played now, his versatility would be perfectly suited for today's game. And also a key nuance between the 91 game and the 90 game. You remember Grant Hill wasn't on that 90 team.
No.
He was a freshman in 91, and that was the key, whereas before they didn't have that guy that could really handle the ball, beat his man one-on-one, handle that UNLV intense pressure defense. The next year, they had seen the defense before, but then UNLV did not have quite as much depth as they had the previous year either.
No.
And then combine that with the addition of Grant Hill and his versatile skill set, that made them much more apt to better handle the UNLV pressure defense. Not to mention, the referees kind of kept Anthony and Larry Johnson in foul trouble throughout the game.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
That's another topic for another day.
Right.
So,
it came down to the final shot. Larry Johnson gets an offensive rebound, and he makes one of two. He actually misses both of them, but Thomas Hill get caught for a lane violation, so he gets another free throw. He makes that one to tie the game at 77. Okay, Christian Laettner goes down. He gets fouled. He goes to the line, sinks both of his. It came down to this shot. Larry Johnson driving the ball up the floor, and I'm sitting there, dude, shoot it. No, he doesn't. He hesitates. They collapse the defense around him. They pass it over to Anderson Hunt. Now, Anderson Hunt is a pretty decent three-point shooter, but that night he was just off. I mean, he was off. He did score 29 in the game, but he was like maybe 1 for 7 from three-point range. And he was just off, and he took a shot, and it just rimmed out. Bobby Hurley rebounds it, and people just went absolutely crazy that Duke had beaten this juggernaut UNLV running Rebel team, who you can say what you want about that team or whatever, but that team was so good as far as fundamentals and the way they played the game. Yeah, they were brash. Yeah, they were the ones who started when somebody grabs a rebound, start yelling as they get the rebound, thanks to, one of my favorite players from the year before, Moses Scurry, if you remember that. But,
yes,
and a lot of people didn't like Gary Tarkanian because they thought that he was doing some recruiting illegalities, which was found out later, obviously, but still people didn't like him, because he told the truth. He basically said, this is what's going on. This is this is the reason why I'm doing this or whatever. But he was, very visionary coach. He didn't believe in being classy and stuff like that. When the team gets up by 30, start taking his players on. No, he didn't do that. He didn't. He ran up the score. He did that to Loyola Marymount when they played earlier that year, and, Paul Westhead would run up the score. It was cute. When they did it, he was classless. You know what I'm saying? So he ran it up on Loyola Marymount, which kind of ticked me off because I like Loyola Marymount. But this team here was so... And if this team were to play now in college basketball, no one would beat them. Nobody would, because they was just so fundamentally sound. They wouldn't take threes, but every time you missed a three, by the time the ball was hitting the ground, it was when it was coming through the basket. That's the only time that ball would hit the ground, because they were pass, score. Pass, score. That was them. Up-tempo, high-octane, Larry Johnson, Stacey Augmon, one of the most underrated college point guards ever in Greg Anthony, and when they lost, I was heartbroken. And that started me becoming a big-time Duke hater. And yes, I am proud to say that I am a Duke hater. For those of you who don't like that, tough. I am a Duke hater. I admit it.
Yes, and I agree with you. And a lot of I never liked him either. And a lot of that. Speaking of Anderson Hunt, he was kind of out of sync because he was kind of forced to play a lot of minutes at the point guard position in that game due to Greg Anthony's foul trouble as well as their lack of depth that particular year. Because the previous year, as you mentioned before, Moses Scurry, Greg Butler, they had some. Everett Gray, if I remember correctly, they had some guys, some depth, some extra depth, where that defensive intensity on that pressure defense would remain constant due to UNLV's depth. And then speaking, of the game, it was just like they just could not ever shake away. It seems like, because I still remember it was a sequence where Duke had been with them the entire time, and then they finally got up 5, and it looked like they were about to go on one of those big runs and put the game away. This was probably like about 8 to go in the second half. But then Bobby Hurley promptly comes down, bang, hits a 3, cuts it right back to 2, letting everybody know, okay, this is going to go down to the wire. It's going to be a full 40 minutes. And then you also have to remember the context of the game as well. In addition to the blowout loss the previous year, even though, as we mentioned a couple episodes back, Johnny Dawkins had put them on the map in '86 as a perennial power. They
Yeah.
had been to a handful of Final Four trips, maybe 4 or 5. They hadn't won the championship yet. They
No.
they they, they hadn't won the national championship yet. And then along with that win versus UNLV, they played, if I remember correctly, they played Kansas, which was an afterthought. I never
Yeah.
even watched the championship game, and
Yeah.
they finally
Kansas.
broke
Kansas
through
was
and
led
won the
by
first national
Kansas.
championship.
Yeah, Kansas was led by
Greg
it was Roy
Ostertag.
it was Roy Williams' first year as head coach of Kansas. He had took over for Larry Brown, and you had Greg Ostertag, got the likes of Greg Ostertag and Adonis Jordan at point guard. Like,
Adonis Jordan,
yeah,
bum.
yeah. I mean, I mean, he was not good. He was not. He did not measure up to those others. But that they had beat North Carolina in the Final Four in the game before that one that Saturday night. I remember that was my senior year of high school.
Yes.
That was when I really, really got into college basketball. Right around that time, the late '80s, early '90s.
Yes.
Okay, that does it for
Yes.
me as far as like the games that just got to me. But you got one left, okay, which is boxing. Talk about that. What is the boxing one that to this day it still bothers you? Now you're like between the two of us, you are like the boxing expert. So I defer to you as far as this is concerned, and I'll try to fill in where I could go with this. And I probably, I don't know which one what you're talking about, which one are you going to highlight, but I kind of could add some things to it. But go right ahead. Who you got?
I got several, like Roy Jones being robbed of the gold in the Olympics in 1988.
Okay,
He
yeah.
fought South Korean fighter, and the Olympics was in Seoul that year, and he got robbed. But I got several, but I'm going to hone in on one, man. And it's probably not the one that you think, because I know in my introductory episode I had spoke of the Leonard versus Hearns 1981, and I cried and all of that. But I'm going to focus on this is still one that burns me up. 1990, fight about the name of the Mexican legend, Julio Cesar Chavez.
Okay, yep.
Fought Mildred Taylor, who was part of that great 1984 Olympic team, along with like Sweepy Whitaker, Tyrell Briggs, who else? Evander Holyfield was on that team as well. It was a star-studded cast. But he was fighting Mildred Taylor. Chavez went to the fight 68-0 with 56 KOs. Mildred Taylor was 24-0 with one draw, 14 KOs. They both were on everyone's pound for pound top 5 list. And the fight, this was a 12-round fight. Throughout the fight, Taylor, kind of with his ring generalship and so forth, kind of controlled the pace of the fight. Was winning most of the rounds, but obviously, Cesar Chavez, the ultra technician as well as pressure fighter, he kept the pressure on throughout, landing power punches. He wasn't outlanding Taylor, but the shots that he was landing, he was making them count. So as you get into the championships, rounds started around round 10, you could see some of the punishment that Chavez was dishing out, despite not winning a lot of rounds, beginning to take its toll on Taylor. With swelling, Taylor had fast hands, fast feet, was using his lateral movement to control him a little bit.
Right.
That kind of had slowed down a bit. So basically, long story short, in the 12th and final round, he just basically had to remain standing, and he would win the fight because he was well ahead on everyone's scorecards.
Yeah.
Cesar Chavez, the crowd and his corner, they pressing him on because, he's 68-0.
Yeah.
So they don't want him to lose. He finally gets to him within the last 15 seconds of the fight. He finally gets to him. He knocks Mildred Taylor down with under 10 seconds to go. Basically, as I mentioned before, Mildred Taylor, if he gets up, he wins. He gets up, he beats the count with 5 seconds left. And I don't know if you remember this name, but he's kind of been in some infamous affairs before. Referee that goes by the name of Richard Steele.
Oh God,
Um,
yeah.
he's asking Mildred Taylor, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?" He stops the fight with 2 seconds left, and Chavez wins by knockout.
That's true. I
And
forgot
it's just
about
like,
that. Right? Yeah. That brings.
it's like,
Yeah,
come
yeah.
on.
I know what you're talking about now. Because when you tell me, because I'm like, when you said Cesar Chavez and Mildred Taylor, I'm like, that fight reminds me of something. I just don't remember what it was. What is about that fight that, because again, you're the boxing expert. Me, I watch boxing, but I'm not really a boxing historian. Okay. But when you said those two names, it's like, okay, what is it about that fight that I remember? There's something about that fight that I remember that was weird. Okay. And then they stopped the fight with 2 seconds left and gave it to Chavez. That's crazy.
Correct. And and boxing has a reputation of being a gangster, unethical, and corruption-filled sport.
Yeah.
And it always has been. And then, Richard Steele in the post-fight interview, he like, well, when I see that someone has had enough, I don't really care about the time. When asked, was he aware how much time was left on the clock?
But
they
2
have the
seconds
red light
though?
right there on the corner, which was blinking, which signaled that with less than 10 seconds left. Of course, he was aware, but Chavez was a Don King fighter and all that, and he was in the fight. And then, of course, due to the punishment that Mildred Taylor was has taken, boxing is one of those sports where you can lose your entire prime in one fight in one night if you're not careful. And this was one of those instances. He was never the same after that. And just to put a nice bow on this, that fight was both named by Ring Magazine the fight of the year for 1990, as well as the fight of the decade for the entire 90s decade. And just about corruption, let me just add this on. His Olympic teammate Pernell Whitaker fights Chavez 3 years later. He schools him from pillar to post, and I don't know if you remember Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker. He was slick. He can stand in a shower stall and don't get wet. That's just how slick he was, Right. So he schools Chavez from pillar to post, and they scored the fight a draw because Chavez was 86-0 at the time. So they scored that fight a draw, even though he clearly beat Chavez. So that's a little bit about.
Did they determine this to be the fight of the decade of the 1990s, right? In all weight classes or just that weight class? Wow.
Everybody. Any fight that took place in the 90s, that was the fight of the decade. No matter the weight class, no matter the opponents, no matter who it was, that was the fight of the decade. It was called it won Ring Magazine Fight of the Year in 1990, and then it subsequently won Ring Magazine's Fighter of the Decade for the entire 1990s decade, which was on which built off the success of the 80s decade, which was the golden age. That was kind of a golden age as well. The 80s and the 90s was really a big time golden era for weight classes, non-heavyweight, but heavyweight too, but
in all weight classes.
Really
because you saw the emergence of Floyd Mayweather, you saw the emergence of Oscar De La Hoya, Manny Pacquiao, Cesar Chavez. You got all these fighters that fought, and that's the one you made me want to go back and watch this fight on YouTube. I'm probably going to do that sometime this week because you got me interested. I want to see this fight, because again, I remember hearing about it. I remember when you brought up the two fighters, I was like, they sound so familiar, and then when you told me what happened, I'm like, oh, that's right. I remember that. Yeah, I was in high school when that took place, and boxing was like big. during the time I was in high school, which was like in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, of course, you had the highlight of it was James Buster
Yes.
Douglas beating Mike Tyson in 1990. I would have thought that would have been a fight of the decade, when Buster Douglas upset Tyson in Tokyo. I remember that when it
Yes.
happened. I was at home and because the fight was in Tokyo, okay, and they announced it like at
Yes.
12, 1 o'clock in the morning. And I was like going to bed, and I turned on ESPN and
Yes.
it said, breaking news, Mike Tyson loses to James Buster Douglas, gets knocked out. I'm like, what? And I was just shocked, and that's all we talked about
Yeah.
in school for like the next 2 weeks. That's all we talked about. Somebody had finally got a copy of the fight. One of my friends got a VHS copy of the fight. Showed you how long ago it was. We went to his house. Me and about 10 other guys went to his house and watched the fight. And we were like, oh my God, do you believe this? It was crazy. But this was a great exercise, man. This was really
Couple of
cool.
caveat-
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. No, I was just gonna say about Buster Douglas and Tyson. You remember these were the days when you had to buy it. This is when you first started being able to order the pay-per-views at home.
Yes.
Or even, we used to call it on showcase.
Yes.
Like a lot of times you would, if you could put it on the station, you could hear the sound, but the picture would be scrambled. And then, as a little kid, sometimes they had some of them other channels too that were, some of them other channels that.
Yes, some other channels that were not kid friendly.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was my parents were gone to church that night. It was a Saturday night. My parents were going to like some type of program or something that night, and I was at home by myself. So I just put this was back in the days when ESPN used to give the round by round updates.
Yeah.
But I put it on the actual station and just listened to it. And even though I couldn't see the fight, I heard it in its entirety. And just to educate our listeners, this, like how most people think that this was an upset, like Buster Douglas got lucky and landed a lucky punch to win the fight.
Yeah.
Buster Douglas, for one night, because he dedicated the fight to his recently deceased mom, and he dominated the fight with his jab and his hand speed. And for one night, that particular Buster Douglas that night would have been hell on any heavyweight ever for one night. That's how great and how good he was that night. He never came close to that level of greatness before nor subsequent to that. But for that one night, he was bad to the bone that night. He whooped Tyson from pillar to post that night.
Yeah, he did. I mean, we all was of the consensus before we saw the fight that he got lucky, until we saw the fight. And when we saw the fight, we were like, no, this dude beat Tyson. No, he beat him, And, you saw Tyson scrambling to get his mouthpiece and everything. And we were like sitting there just in shock. Like, I don't believe this dude actually got beat like this. That was our attitude walking out. We're like, bro, I can't believe that Mike Tyson, Iron Mike Tyson, Mr. Punch Out himself, got beat down like this, against this nobody. And that's where we looked at it. We looked at him, and that basically he was a nobody.
Yes.
He was, just like they used to say about Joe Louis fighters back in the 40s, the bum of the month, and that was
correct.
We were like shocked that this happened, and we were shocked that he lost, but even more shocked of how he lost, which was crazy. But like I said, man, this was great. This was like a really cool exercise in this. Now, going from crying in our beers and stuff like that, I want to relate to you guys a story that's going to make you laugh. And it's going to, it was what I did. And I really do believe that I cost an NFL team a victory Once upon a time, yes, I actually believe that I had actually cost an NFL team by watching this game. I had cost them a victory. The story about this and this very unfortunate incident coming up right after this short break. You're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports podcast right here on the Sports History Network. And we're back, and you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports podcast right here on the Sports History Network, along with my partner in sports history crime, Charles Combs. I'm Dana Auguster, and I want to relate to you a story that's in our shout-out section. And we talked about in this episode mainly about losses that have been looked upon by us as ones that are very, shall I say, traumatic. I talked about my Chargers losing to the Patriots in the playoffs of the early 2000s. Chuck talked about the Bartman incident at Wrigley Field during the baseball playoffs of 2004. Of 2003 it was, right? Yeah. And now I want to relate to you a story. I want to relate to you guys a story in which I really feel to this day, all these years later, that I was responsible for this team's losing a football game just by opening my big fat mouth. All right, here's the story. Okay. On December 21st, 2003, me and my newly minted fiance, who's now my wife, Nicole, was in New Orleans doing some last minute Christmas shopping, just hanging out in New Orleans for the day. And it was a good day to go because the Saints was out of town that weekend. They were playing on the road. So we're walking around, we do some shopping, we went to the Riverwalk, and we decided to get something to eat before we headed home. So we went to this one, I forgot the name of the place, but we went to this one little cafe in the French Quarter to get us something to eat, right? So we sit down there, we eat and everything, and we notice the Saints game was on. That particular afternoon, December 21st, 2003, the Saints was on the road against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And of course, the Saints were losing. But they were within striking distance, okay? The Jags were leading 20-13 in a very low-scoring game, defensive slugfest between these two clubs. 7 seconds left in the game. Me and Nikki, my wife, fiance at the time, we were about to get up and walk out the door, and we were like, let's see what happens. 7 seconds left. They need a miracle beyond miracles. Nikki was like, oh, this game's over. Let's go, whatever. So I'm like, no, this is one last play. So she sat there, we looking at the television screens with about maybe 5 or 6 other people standing around us watching the same television screen. Then this ensues. Aaron Brooks drops back to pass, throws to Dante Stallworth. He catches it at midfield. He takes off running. Right before he gets tackled, he pitches it to the beer man, Michael Lewis. Remember him, all Saints fans?
Yes, I do.
Michael Lewis gets it, and he takes off running. He gets to the Jags' 25-yard line. Right before he hits the ground, he pitches it to Deuce McAllister. Deuce McAllister lumbers another 5 or 6 yards, lose about 2 more Jaguar defenders, and at the last second pitches it to Jerome Pathon, who literally could walk into the end zone for a touchdown. to potentially tie the game at 20 to send the game into overtime. Now, this was very important for the Saints because in order for the Saints to make the playoff, they had to win their final 2 games. They had 2 games remaining on their schedule. They had that game, and I believe their next game was against the Buccaneers. So they still had a chance to make the playoffs. Albeit slim, they still had a shot. As they're lining up for the extra point, people around us are absolutely cheering because you have to remember this is the Saints. This is something that would happen to the Saints, not for the Saints. Running an impossible miracle finish that was reminiscent of the Stanford Cal running over the band multi-pitch finish in 1982. This is this is the pro version of that. And the Saints of all teams pulled it off. As they're lining up the kick, everybody in the cafe giving themselves high fives. This is my wife, my future wife, Nicole, was absolutely beside herself. I can't believe that happened. I actually saw a miracle finish live in real time. She had never seen anything like that before as it happened. Then it happened. I opened my mouth. As John Carney, the Saints kicker, was lining up for the extra point, ex-Charger, by the way, so I've seen a lot of his kicks. Very clutch kicker when he came right down to it. As he's lining up for the extra point, I say out loud, "Oh my God, why do I get the feeling he's going to miss?" The looks, Chuck, I got from the people that were around me was like, why in the world did you say that? You know, felt like, well, he's John Cornyn, he ain't gonna make it. I'm just joking with y'all. Sure enough, he kicks it and he pushes it to the right. No good. Jags win. You remember the old television commercial for Southwest Airlines when somebody does something really stupid and the narrator says, "Want to get away?" Well, that was me. Lord knows I wanted to get away. The looks I got from the people in that nice little cafe in the French Quarter, and the worst look I got was from Nikki. Now, Charles, you know Nikki. She's very sweet, very lovable, extremely attractive lady.
Yes.
She had this look that I'm solely convinced to this day that if somebody would have handed her a revolver at that moment, she would not have hesitated. She would have shot me cold dead right there. And it gets worse. It gets worse. We're on the way home and there's not a word being spoken. She is the descendant. She is the daughter of a crazy Saints fan. And I know Mr. Mac Augustine listens to the show, and Nikki's dad, he's loves the show, but he's also a diehard Saints fan. And she's the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We're riding back, heading back home from New Orleans. She's not speaking to me at all. She is like stone silent. You know, like one of those guards at the Royal Guard in London, not saying a word, not even making eye contact with me. We turn on ESPN radio. That afternoon, the Chargers were playing, I want to say the Raiders, and they were up big on the Raiders. And they announced the score. And I say, oh, well, the Chargers are winning. Chuck, at that moment, when I mentioned the Chargers, and I said, well, at least they're winning, but kind of sarcastically, Nikki let out a stream of expletives that would have made a longshoreman blush. I mean, she cut loose on me. What the F you mean? And so that's the story of me causing an NFL team to lose by opening my mouth. You want to call jinx? That is the jinx of all jinxes. me actually saying, yeah, why do I get the feeling he's going to miss? So that's it right there. I come clean. That was all me. That I caused the Saints to lose that miracle finish.
Oh boy, that is crazy. But you know how I am, man. This is the differences. How the kids say nowadays they stand on business. I have stood on
Yeah.
business, and they're like, dude, what you mad for? The Saints lose all the time. You ought to be used to it by now. What are you upset about?
I mean, I
Like,
felt, Chuck,
yeah,
I
man.
felt
But then,
so bad,
the
dude.
Saints.
The Saints back then, I mean, like they had Aaron Brooks at quarterback. A couple of years earlier, they had won their first playoff game when they beat the Rams, who incidentally, the fumble was caused by Oz Hakeem, who went on a date once with my sister. But anyway, that's another story for another day. A little quick factoid right there. Oz Hakeem actually went on a date with my sister. Anyway,
I was at that game, man. I was
yeah.
actually at that game. You know.
When they lost to the Rams, oh yeah, that was crazy. I mean, I watched the game with a friend of mine, my friend from
Yeah.
Canada. They came down and I took them to New Orleans the day after. Because they came in on that. The game was on a Saturday. They came in on a
Okay.
Saturday, and I took them. I
Yep.
took them to New Orleans that Sunday and that Monday. Because it was like right over. It was right at like that time, right between Christmas and New Year's. I want to say, or right after New Year's, or right before New Year's. That's what it was. It was right before New Year's.
No,
And
the game was on New Year's Eve, 2000.
yeah, that's right. That's right. But yeah, it was. Wow, it was. That's a game that I would never live down. And that game was brought up a few years ago when the Saints lost to the Vikings in the miracle in Minneapolis. The whole we talked about once. Case Keenum. With the miracle throw, he had no business completing that pass. And I brought that up. It's like, you remember that time we was in New
Marcus
Orleans?
Williams, man.
Remember that time I asked Nikki, like, you remember that time we was in New Orleans and that happened? And she just looked at me and just walked out the room. Because she was PO'd that the Saints had lost, the
Only
Saints
the Saints, man.
Only the Saints. Only the Saints. If you know, you know. If you're a Saints fan or you're a football fan, if you know the Saints, you know. You just know. But anyway, this was a really cool episode. I really want to thank my man
Yes.
Charles for coming in and joining us tonight. And once again, if you have a story if you're listening in and you have a story or something that you want to share with us, dealing with a very traumatic loss that you've suffered as a fan, please don't hesitate. Let us know. We'll probably take some time out and read your email right on the air, and just let everybody know this is from so-and-so and this is what happened to him,
Yes.
and we're going to talk about it. Okay. So once again, thank you guys for joining us, and you're
Yes.
listening to the Sports History Network's Historically Speaking Sports. Chuck, thank you once again for joining us.
Oh, always a pleasure, man. Looking forward to next time.
Thank you guys once again for joining us here on the Historically Speaking Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network. This show comes to you from the Bill King Memorial Studio in the sports wing of TM4 Enterprises, located in suburban Atlanta in the shadow of Stone Mountain. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to the show and look us up on the various social media platforms. And just search for Historically Speaking Sports for your daily dose of sports history. And as always, tell people about us. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, tell your neighbors. Hell, tell passersby on the street if you think they like sports history. It would really, really help us out. Thanks once again for joining us, and on behalf of Charles Combs, I'm Dana Augusta, your purveyors of sports history on this fine program. Have a good morning, have a good afternoon, or have a good night wherever you're catching us. Peace out.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The heel gets the heat. The babyface gets the cheers.
But the jobber gets, well, the job done. And speaking of jobbers, Barry Horowitz wasn't there to win titles. He was there to build them. By selling every move, every storyline, and every new star that stepped into the ring. He was the secret sauce. And now, he's the headline in his new book titled Wrestling is My Gimmick, My Life on the Wrong Side of the 3 Count. This memoir is a deep dive into wrestling's most underrated position and the man who made it an art form. Whether you're a fan of wrestling, a fan of sports history, or just love a great story, this book is for you. Again, that's Wrestling is My Gimmick by Barry Horowitz. Grab your copy today before the count strikes 3.